Can we please have a round of applause for our speakers for the session? Pinaki De, Cheyenne Olivier, and Nicolas Wild.
They got me used to take them there.
Yeah. This all introduction.
C'est pas du tout impressionnant. Non, c'est bon, c'est pas intimidant.
Oh gosh, the zipper got stuck.
What do you need? Oh, you need your...
Yeah, I did just this handout once so that I don't get lost. Evening, everyone. We are a bit late, I hope. I don't know. But I could see a lot of people here want to listen to this session. First of all, let me introduce you to Nicolas Wild, who is the author of Kabul Disco. Also, Silent was Zarathustra. He has, of course, published some more in French, which is still not translated in English. And also, let me introduce you to the noted illustrator, Cheyenne Olivier. She has just illustrated the cookbook that's written by Obhijit Binayak Bandyopadhyay. So, and she's also doing a lot of projects, including projects with Neil Mukherjee. So, today we will sort of mainly focus on such certain things. The topic is actually about the contemporary comic scene in Paris, in France. But of course, we will touch upon a lot of other things as well. We will talk about India, the situation here. We will talk about their own work. And, so it's important to look at themselves as well within the entire French scene or tradition. And so we will do that. So what I'll do is I will alternate between both Nicolas and Cheyenne. And I just hope, we keep a kind of a parity between the kind of questions asked. Okay, so I'll start off with Cheyenne. So can you start? So first of all, let me tell you one thing, that both of them have strong illustration background. Both of them studied illustration and then, of course, made it to comics. So that's a very important thing to note. So Cheyenne, first of all, I just want to ask, you grew up in, of course, France, and the whole idea here is that, the Franco-Belgian comic scene is one of the most vibrant in the world, and we all know that. So what was your formative influence, initially when you were a child? How did comics culture influence your, growing up in the place?
So I'm Franco-Belgian, actually.
Yeah.
So part of my family lives in Brussels, and actually has a huge collection of comics. So I have one uncle, for example, who had to raise the ceiling of a room in his house to actually fit the shelves that would host, I don't remember how many thousands of comics he had. So that obviously was a huge influence. And I would also sneak into my grandparents' ceiling grenier. Yeah, also sitting attic, exactly,
Attic,
into
yeah.
my grandparents' attic, and I would read comics, obviously Tintin, Asterix, all the Franco-Belgium. But also later, we always had the Fruit Glacial, Charlie Hebdo on the table of our living rooms. That was a huge influence. And of course, when I was 11, I think my dad, who's a bus driver, discovered that one of the students he was carrying left a manga under the seat. So he brought home a manga saying, "Oh, I found this. You might find it interesting." So I started to read it, of course, in the wrong direction. But that opened up a huge interest in manga, which is still very true in France now. Most of the publishing, at least in children's literature, is done by manga. That's the main force now.
So, Nicolas, in your case,
Actually, it's quite similar. When I grew up, we have Tintin and Snowy, I think.
Yeah.
That comics book. Even my father, when he was a kid, he would read them. So that's something we had in the house, and I was reading them since I was like 4. First, just reading the pictures, like and guessing what happened. And also we had Mafalda. It's an Argentinian comics book, which was very popular in France. And with Tintin was this idea of traveling and drawing, like travel with the drawings and travel with your mind. And I thought to a certain point one day I wanted to travel and to draw the world, which I'm doing now. So maybe this influence is very strong, I think. And when I was a teenager, I read more like science fiction comics book or something called Torgal Eigerson. That's the adventures of Vikings in north of Europe. And after, I didn't read manga, but on television we had a lot of Japanese cartoons, such as Goldorak or Astro Boy or stuff like that. And in the 90s, I started reading comics such as comics from L'Association, David Bay, Lewis Trondheim, and that's another influence, a later one. And yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So I note that in the French comic scene, the magazines played a huge role, right? So like something like the Tata magazine, right? The Tintin magazine or the Tanta magazine, or say the say Pilote, for example. So Pilote was a huge influence initially, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
What's interesting is that there is a particularity in the French publishing is that there is a law in 1949 there was a law that was passed to prevent the flood of American comics to somehow corrupt the youth because and that's something that was very politically on all sides. They all agreed that there was something to be done to prevent the young French children to be corrupted by all the nude women, all the violence that could be found in comics. And that's a law that's still here today. That's one of the only censor law that it's still there today. And since it blocked most of the American influence, it opened up the way for actually the Franco-Belgians to
explore their own stuff.
Like pilots to actually get their public and to promote a more local
right.
production.
So we see a lot of proliferations of different kinds. In fact, the styles also differ, right? So on one hand, you have the Ligné-Claire style, and you have the Marcinelle style. So Lucky Luke is very different. Say somebody like Jean Roba would probably draw Billet Bull in a very different fashion, say, than Arj, right?
Yeah.
So we are, in Bengali, one of the things is, of course, that we are very much acquainted with Tintin, probably because of the translations being done here. There's a huge body of Tintin. Almost all of them are translated in Bengali. So our acquaintance with French comics is mainly through Tintin. But, so when I grew up, I was very surprised to see the different kind of technique. So, if you can tell a bit about, say Lucky Luke or Spirou, all these other people, people like Roba, people like Peo, and their drawing styles, which are completely different from Ligné-Claire. For us, it's all Ligné-Claire, right? We cannot see beyond Ligné-Claire because of our upbringing. So can you just comment on it, the stylistic differences?
Yeah, what's interesting in Franco-Belgian comics book, there is genre comics book, such as Western and science fiction, for instance, which are not very explored in cinema. So it's very big. So we know the cowboys such as Lucky Luke, Blueberry. And about the line, it changes depending on the personality of the artist. And also the kind of story you want to bring. Like Tintin, the stories are a bit classical, so the line is very well drawn and everything. But Boule et Bill, it's more like sketchy and funny, so the line is more cartoonesque. And,
right.
Les Bidochons, maybe?
Yeah.
That's very sketchy and the humor is very rough. And so depending on the style of story you want to bring and your audience, on the personality of the artist, the style is very different. And you can recognize one comics book very easily You can say, that's Robert, that's...
So that's kind of a signature,
yes,
you know?
it's a signature.
But I would say they also know very well the printing process after that, the fact that some colors are not going to render well, so they have a way of differentiating the line, the contours, and the colors on another side, so they also work with those constraints that maybe we don't have anymore because of the digital. We can have any color, we can have any shape. I guess they were maybe...
So that is what we are talking actually, you know, printing sometimes also, you know, necessitate a kind of style to be, you know,
exactly. It's just that sometimes you can't hold on too much to the original, and your original is as you like. The colors are, your yellow is bright, but then you have so many layers of translation from the original to the scan, to then Photoshop, to then the printer, to then the kind of paper that is maybe a little too white or too yellow, that it will change the color. So you have to know a little bit more about all the different body of work that come before and after your work.
Nicholas, I don't think you do colors at all, right? You do?
Not so much, actually. Yeah, when I do big graphic novels, I do it in white and black because actually I have a disease and I see the word in black and white.
Okay.
So I don't see the colors.
And it translates very well, you know. So
no, actually, just kidding. I see but I think depending what you want to do, like I think my stories, they work in white and black. I tried to colorize them, but then I didn't recognize them as something wrong with the ambience was different. I don't know why.
Right. Now, you know, let me also put this in perspective because, you know, in our country, for example, it is very difficult, you know, to survive just to, you know, work as a comic artist. And both of you are illustrator, comic artist, but mostly illustrating and comic artist. That's your profession. So how difficult it is, even in a place like France and Belgium, where there are so many opportunities. In India, of course, how many comic books, you know, really we have in a year? We can count in hand. I mean, in France, it's impossible. So there is a downside to it, which you are sort of, and this is a question to both of you. How difficult it is? I mean, or is it getting more difficult nowadays? And if you both of you can take it, maybe one after another. The same question.
It's not so easy, actually, to make a living out of comics book only. So there's some artists, they do something else on the side, like some are teachers or some are having an actual job. I think maybe there's 10% of the comics book artists who are doing very well. Like 33% are doing not so well. And in between, you have like people who are doing well, not so well, like there's waves. Sometimes one book is selling well, sometimes it doesn't. Some people are out of fashion after a while, like you can be very successful for a decade, and next decade, nobody is reading your books anymore. There's many, it depends really.
But it's also that in our training, we are not really trained to think about those issues. I remember when I graduated, we graduated from the same school. Right after when we graduated from the master, we had, I think, 1 hour lecture on how difficult and precarious the job was. So that was our main introduction to the reality of the job, the fact that you have to have contracts, you have to know how to handle them, to send things to a publisher. That's something that's really not taught. And I can see that for one reason, which is when you are in an art school, you have to and you want to develop your own language and you want to be 300% focused on that. So maybe just you don't have the bandwidth to think about
all these things.
All these things, and I understand that. And I think sometimes we had like low classes, and I was not the most. I was not so much paying attention, but I still think that it makes the job much more precarious.
If you think too much about it.
But no, the fact that you don't have a real training about it, it makes so.
I think now there's training for those things, but I was not very good myself at teaching myself those things, because there's also a belief when you are an artist, you know, you want to be poor, you know, like there's a romantic notion, like creating art is like it's something you live in the world of ideas, and money is like the world of the actual world. And you don't think of it, you just... but I think maybe now the new generation, they have better training for understanding what is the market, how to sell their work. I know we both were in Boston for a while, and in art school in America, they really teach how to make money with art. There's classes about that, it's normal. But in France, there's a concept of making money with art. Sometimes it's like it's not so popular.
There is definitely this romantic idea of the artist that connects very much to the idea of the creator as being one isolated island who is at the root of the whole work. When in fact you work with so many people. You work with the printer, you work with the publisher, you work with the communication team. So I think those skills, for example, should be more
Taught, maybe?
Taught, yes,
Yep.
definitely too.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
those
it's,
are like life-saving skills that you need to acquire, even
Yes.
if you illustrate well. Yeah, I understand that as a designer, because you know, when you do a design, you not only design the book, you actually negotiate with a lot of other people, stakeholders, and probably come at a common ground.
Yes, and people don't, they will see the name of the author on the book, and all of the other contributors won't appear, so you really have this impression that the author is doing this and handling it on his own, but actually most of the work is influenced and negotiated through all the steps of the book. And also, most of the time, the origin of the book itself comes from somewhere else, so that's something that's completely not, in my sense.
Yeah, it's like comics book and books. It's an industry, you know. As you said, there is a lot of people working in it, and usually when you have a project, you have maybe 5% of inspiration, and 95% of technique, and industrial work, and sweat.
Yep. Now, you know, let me go into a different direction, you know. Look, of course, we have big publishers publishing comics. Of course, you have Casterman, in French, actually. So you have Dargaud, Lombard. Lombard has become big, right? I mean, it's a bit bigger now. But, you know, how do, you know, small presses, you know, survive? You know, I mean, are they making a mark? Or, you know, in this big world where, you know, everything is window shopping, you know, ultimately, you know what is good only if you see it, right? So you need to have that economic muscle to push in, you know, the books on the table. So, you know, how do you think, you know, both of you, you can take the question, because I think it is important for the smaller press also to get into in order to get this diversified work.
But they mostly, they will, since now it's much easier to reprint also, they will print very little of one book. They'll throw it in the sea and see if it stays afloat. There is very much every year there are so many new books that come out. They are thrown there, but then they are not also so well pushed to the public. So they'll see if it catches.
Good.
It's nice. It can then go to a next level, but it can also very easily sink.
Yeah, and sometimes the reason a book is selling sometimes are mysterious. Just some book you will never believe become bestsellers, and some book were programmed to become bestsellers don't sell. And sometimes there is the personality of the artist. If he has a blog or a lot of followers on Instagram, for instance, he can. If he has
Self-publish?
Yeah, there is the new, more and more people are doing self-publication. There is
But is it sustainable?
Lisa Mandel, for instance,
Mandel,
was doing
Okay.
She says she makes much more money since she's
Who?
launched her
who?
on publishing, because
Okay.
the repartition of the money a book makes
Okay.
is so unequal. I think, especially if I am a children's picture book illustrator, I think we are on the lowest percentage
Of commission.
Yeah, even compared to comic artists.
Yeah, that's unfair, but it depends on.
So the small independent presses will launch many of those trials. They'll see if it picks up, and sometimes one will really pick pick up a little bit like, for example, what Persepolis is doing for l'association. It's their main base, and since they have that gets reprinted easily yearly, they can rely on it, so then they can publish much smaller, experimental, new kind of work.
Yeah, so actually we were discussing a lot of things before we came here, and one of the names, or the names that came up again and again, is L'Association. For the uninitiated, L'Association is that, amazing, group of comic artists coming together, people like David B., Marc Contour, Louis Tondheim, Johan Farr. And if you are not acquainted with this, please go search the internet and look at their work. I think they are amazing. So, L'Association is also a very important turning point, right? So, like 1990, 1990 it was formed, right? Yeah, it was formed in 1990. So, basically, anything to say on that? The kind of influence it has on the comic scene, the different kind of narratives that come out?
Yeah, for me it has lots of influences, because when they started in the 90s, it was artists who couldn't find publishers. So they were showing their work to different publishers, and they said they couldn't find anyone who wanted to publish them. So they decided to create their own publishing house, L'Association. And they started to make things you didn't see that much in the 90s, like a lot of biographic books or books related to social or historic things, and very personal. A lot of, they print everything in black and white first, so there's a new kind of aesthetic and a new kind of genre and storytelling emerged. And it was very refreshing in the 90s to see that, because at the end of the 80s, there wasn't many new exciting things happening in the world of comics book. And when I was studying in Strasbourg in the 90s, we saw all those new people like Persepolis, Lewis Trondheim, and it was a very, very good influence, like how to make comics book differently with humor, and how to talk about yourself in comics book. Like autobiography is it wasn't that popular before, like to talk about ourselves. And that became also very big after when the blog emerged, 10 years after, with internet. So there's a lot of comics book artists who start telling their life or their own stories through internet. And that was another kind of genre. There was even a comics blog festival in France.
Yep. Like, so, we'll probably discuss that as well. One thing, this is to Nicolas specifically, because, Guy Delisle, for example, was published by L'Association, right? And this kind of travel, the kind you also write, completely different in certain ways, is also something that L'Association almost, popularized, right?
Yeah, totally. When I read Pyongyang a long time ago, and it was like, it was amazing. Say, what?
Right.
That's what one of my influence as well, I think.
Yeah. We can make out.
You can go somewhere and just
Right. Now this one is specifically to Catherine. To Cheyenne you. One of the things that became a kind of a point of contest in France. There is this festival at Angoulême, which is of course the festival where all the comic artists around the world congregate. And there was this running debate that comics, prizes and all the things, this is basically an exclusively boys' club, right? And, there was a lot of people actually boycotted the festival because there was no woman artists, who were actually meant to give the Grand Prix. This time, it was won by Julie Douchet, if I'm not wrong, an American, amazing comic artist. Canadian, Julie Douchet. And also earlier, I think Catherine Bretisher won it. Bretisher. So, but what is your take on this? Do you really agree that, it's like a boys' club and, like...
Yes.
Yeah, we are flanked by...
I would agree, and especially... so I grew up reading Fluide Glacial, which is a magazine, like a very satirical, humoristic magazine. And so really when I was perhaps too young to read it, And last time I came back home, I took some of the old magazine to look again and see if it was making me laugh. And actually, it struck me how women were represented. That they had enormous breasts, and basically you could really see that they were mostly writing in a boys' club, and it really struck me at that point. And well, in most art schools, actually, there are mainly women. It's just that, we don't. It is fairly recent that they are put up in the front, and they are really valued for their work.
But we have wonderful women artists, walking, right? Wonderful.
Definitely.
Yeah, one is here tonight.
Oh, yeah. She's, of course, here. So what I'm trying to say is that, there are other things also, this discussion can go long and long. But, I also want to maybe involve the audience as well. Because, French scene is so alien to us in one way. Sometimes, for us, it's only Tintin and Asterix. And maybe Lucky Luke, that's it. But there is so much of work in the French scene that we really don't know of. Another thing is, of course, the huge amount of work, done in allied, aspects, cultural aspects in France. Even in Brussels, for example, the streets are painted with this huge comic murals. The galleries are full of comic, memorabilia. You have a festival where all these things happen again and again. So, this kind of curating, comics was just a medium that was like you could pick up from the street, but you are now pushing it to the galleries as well. So what do you think of that? Because it's a very popular medium, something that can be really accessible. But now sometimes comic arts are like really a big thing, and it's in galleries. So what is your take on this? I mean, both of you, because it's a very interesting thing to note.
But I'm currently doing a PhD in France, not in illustrations, because there is no doctorate in illustration. There is one in comics, but I don't think it's still there. I think I tried to apply, and it was they told me that it was over. But there is definitely more theoretical works done in comics, and partly in the research group where I'm in, and I'm a bit sad that it's not the same about illustration, and that's what we were talking earlier. Somehow it also grew up because there was a growing amount of research that was being done, of theorization that was being done about it, but also professionalization. What we were told in that 1 hour professional lecture was that somehow the comic artists had it. They managed to climb the higher stair, and that we illustrators were still struggling to somehow unite into making our profession less precarious.
Right.
But there's a Museum of Illustration in Strasbourg. But that's
but the whole city of Strasbourg revolves around illustration. They have Tommy Ungerer, who is lightning up. No, it's true, but they're definitely less institutionalized than comics.
But for me, comics, I like to see like actual comics pages and drawings in museums, when you can see how it's made with the ink and the Tipex and the addition and everything. But me, I draw on computer, so I don't have like original drawings of my comics book. And when people want to buy some of my pages or they want to exhibit them in a museum, they are disappointed. It's like, what? I say, I can send you a JPEG file on the internet for a museum. Are you serious? Send a TIFF at least. So to exhibit computer drawings is it's a new challenge. Maybe you can do it other way, like exhibiting like an exhibition about a movie, about cinema, for instance. Maybe you can do like a video of the illustration happening, or but the object itself doesn't exist in my case. But because comics book it's not the final things is the book itself. All the steps leading to the books for me are not something I want to show actually. So it's a bit different.
It depends. It goes back a little bit to your question about how one can live out of comics or illustration, and actually selling the original is something that can balance
Yeah,
amount of
that's a big thing actually.
yeah, that's a thing where you can, maybe not in your case, but in some case, the sale of originals is also, it's a different strand.
Yeah, it depends. But I do draw by hand sometimes, but I don't really sell my illustration. Sometimes there is some requests from people who want you to make a specific drawing for a wedding or...
No, but say an original by Mobius would be like amazing, right? So like it's a good idea that you sometimes, maybe put in one shift and then... Another thing, and maybe we will open this up if you have questions, but one of the things, no discussion of French comics will be complete without mentioning Charlie Hebdo. Okay, and of course, the very idea of freedom of expression, the Charlie Hebdo killing. Actually, we never knew about this magazine. Most of the people never knew about this magazine before the incident happened. And there is a very fine line, the freedom of expression. So, for example, in India, we also have protests, and graphic narratives are coming up in order to depict the protests. For example, all of you, if you have seen Ita Malhotra's, Shaheen Bagh, which is actually a depiction of Shaheen Bagh protest. Things are opening up here as well, these things. So you are associated with Hebdo in one way, Cheyenne? No.
Not associated with them, but it's
you
just that
them.
My school, before I studied in Strasbourg, I studied at the School of Graphic Processes in Paris, which is called Estienne. And many authors from Charlie Hebdo were from there, so my school was organizing every year a caricature competition. So we would have Honoré.
Oh,
Who, I think I was there in 2014 actually.
Right.
He was honored the prize of that competition as a professional. As students, we could participate, and that was a professional thing. So we were at the school when it happened, and there was a huge. Most of my professors were connected to them, so it was a very important part of our teaching also. So we had many workshops about how to handle stereotypes. The fact that somehow we work, our brain works with stereotypes.
But don't you think it's also ironical because they also sort of put in stereotypes as well? So I mean, they are not comics as such. I mean, in that way, cartoons. But even then, it overlaps in certain ways. So what do you think of that? This whole idea of Charlie Hebdo and the freedom of expression. How it is valued in, say, France, which is now a much more multicultural kind of a place, right? So
I think it's important to acknowledge that we have stereotypes, but that we can change them, and actually drawing is a way to change them. So it's important. I don't think it's by casting them off that it's going to solve the problem. Actually, it's going to be worsening the problem, because precisely we wouldn't be able to have a hand on it, or at least provide the ground for a discussion, which is the most important.
You have been to Iran and Afghanistan, and
yes.
so how do you? I mean, the culture a bit there as well. I mean, more than us, of course. So what do you think of that? I mean,
but I
of Charlie Hebdo and the kind of depiction.
It's funny because it's not funny, but the first time the caricature were published in a Danish magazine, it was in 2006, I think.
Right.
And I was living in Afghanistan back then, so there was first riots against a Danish caricaturist. And in Afghanistan, basically, for 3 days, we couldn't go out of the house because there was manifestation in the street. And that was the first moment I really thought about what I was doing myself, like being an illustrator in Afghanistan and like seeing manifestation against cartoonists. It was very, very strange in a sense. But on those manifestations, they were not very spontaneous. I think there was some kind of manipulation because nobody in Afghanistan is reading a Danish cartoonish magazine, so I don't know how it comes to them. And the level of manipulation was very high. Like they said, like the Danish, they don't respect your religion. That's to the Danish, but they haven't seen the drawings. And then when Charlie Hebdo later in 2012, I think, they published a cartoon. There was another that they did for the purpose of freedom of expression, which is very, very high in France. you should be able to say whatever you
Right.
want. Especially the history of satire in France is very long. It's,
Right.
there was like cartoons against Marie Antoinette or Napoleon 200
Right.
years ago. And every time people could draw like a leader, a king, it was good, but I know some cartoonists who drew Charles de Gaulle even had some troubles. So for us, we link the freedom of expression, the freedom of satire with the French Revolution. It's something we have the right, it's a right we took for us. It's a part of our DNA. You know, we are free, we can draw whatever we want, we can say whatever we want. So, and that's very, very strong still today. But after, in the case of Charlie Hebdo, it's very sad they've been shot dead because they drew something. The fact it was very dramatic. Yeah, what else to say?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't-
So if you do the kind of cartoons that you see in Charlie Hebdo, we'll not be doing the session if you do that in India. I mean, I don't think so. We are not that permissive. But anyway, I mean, we have sort of, so anybody who wants to actually come in and join and maybe ask some questions to both Cheyenne and of course Nicolas. So is there a mic so that, yeah, so there are two hands I can see. I mean, it's a bit reflective here. Anybody? Yeah, I can see some, so, yeah. So can you just tell me a question? Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Shane is probably from that part of Belgium from where Harjay held. And in 21st century, we have been rereading his work. And we are adding our political commentary in our times, not in the sense of 20th century ideological orientation, but in our times. And it has faced some criticisms, it has faced some flack. What is his evaluation in a political sense in his own land, the place from you belong?
I think it's, we were talking about it with Pinaki earlier, it's very ambiguous because on the one hand, you could very much be focused on the context, and the context should be analyzed and understood. And on the other hand, some people really look only about the internal work, and I think both approaches are, shouldn't be exclusive because you should understand why what he worked on in the ligne claire, in the clear line, why did it influence other people who could have been just influenced by that graphic dimension and not the contextual dimension. So that's important to understand within the history of the visual. But you can't, oh, sorry. No, I was thinking but you can't just reify what he brought to the comics, and obviously there was a particular historical ideological context that cannot be wiped away. And for example, very recently in the US, associations of teachers and parents made the comics Mouse removed from the curriculum. So I don't think that's a good idea either, because you just, what I feel is that comics provide a good ground for a common discussion, and already entering a discussion is already going on a somehow good path, whatever it ends. So I think just removing the ground for discussion is something that worries me much more than that.
Okay, yeah, you are this lady in the front. Please give the mic.
Good evening, panel. You were talking about independent presses, publishing a lot of comics work. Do you think today in the digital era where, I get introduced to a lot of new comics on Instagram,
Right.
do you think like these 4-framed comics are hindering the comic hinterland, or do you think it's giving a lot of exposure to these independent comics who want to come up through, digital advertising or self-publishing?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but I know some people that are doing comics book, like 9-frame comics book, for instance, or 8, and they reframe it for Instagram, and they leave it complete for Facebook. So, but indeed, it's another approach to narration, because you can't have like huge frame or like oblong frames. So.
There was an attempt a few years ago, but I think they didn't manage to find a good economic model. It was Professor Cyclope.
Right.
Yeah. And we had actually in Strasbourg, we had a class on precisely digital comics. How do you think of the shape of the comics on an iPad or on a mobile phone or on a web page, and how do you find new shapes? So this Professor Cyclope was a website that would each month provide new digital narratives. And in the case of Instagram is right now the place for illustrators to know each other and get to know each other. I don't know if it always leads to concrete projects. I'm a bit skeptical about that, because it's useful to keep up with what people are doing right now, especially since I quit the school very recently, so especially since after that everyone goes in all directions possible, so it's nice to keep up with what's happening. Whether it leads to publication or to good...
Yeah, there's lots of very nice experimentation done on the internet with the scrolling, adding music, like pop-up and clicking things. But in France, people, they read books, comics book in paper a lot. The digital industry never really take off. People really want to have an actual book in their hand, in their shelves. They are very attached to the object, the book. And I think maybe like 15% are reading on the internet, like comics book, but it never really took off. So every 5 years, every 10 years, there's a new attempt to make a new thing and how to... Like I have friends, they created a new magazine called Mazette. You can read on the internet, and there's a lot of content. It's very good, but they didn't have enough audience on the internet. So maybe they'll go back to a paper mode. You know.
It's also the French, just to finish, the French context. We're very attached to the book, to the
One thing
it's a religion, like the book is very important.
One thing I always tell, I mean, I just add to Cheyenne and Nicolas, is that, I'm not being a reactionary here, but, nothing feels better than, the real paper, the turning of the page itself. The very act of turning the page is very important while reading a comics book. I personally feel, yes, you can do that in Kindle and all that. I know my son feels so comfortable with that, but I mean, many will actually take this out of the context, but I'm not against digital stuff. I myself like digital stuff. But sometimes, the materiality of the book, it's so much involved with the comics history as well, right?
But there we somehow deny the digital materiality too. Because eventually,
ultimately, yes.
Touching the screen of an iPad is also a material, a very sensitive reaction. Right. So my sense is more that we should somehow go away from trying to reproduce what we do very well with the book on the digital media, and more try to do what we can do with the media itself and the digital.
Yeah, and also me personally, I buy a lot of comics book for Christmas or birthdays. So I like to gift a book. I cannot give a USB with it's a bit cheap. And to have like a artist book signing with drawings, for instance, in festivals.
Unless it's an NFT.
Yeah. So another question?
Yeah, it's a question on the kind of business French books are doing in France. I know that it's 33% of French comic book industry is controlled by manga.
Right.
Or manga-related things.
Right.
Okay. So about 5,000 odd books are published in French. The little research that I have done in French comics. So how would this, French are very open as far as allowing manga since I think it started in mid-90s.
Right.
And it's almost like a flood now. Initially there was some exchange, but now I feel it's feeling. Tell me, I mean, how do you feel about it? That you are creating the whole Franco-Belgian tradition. I see changes in recent works. Some recent artists are reflective of the manga styling.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I mean, I just want to know how you people would react to such a thing of a. I mean, it's
So both
also
of you.
business because you work
Yeah,
on.
actually, the manga we have in France are a translation, so it's French publishers who are translating manga to the French market. And some of them are very good, so I'm very glad I have a chance to read them. But indeed, France is the second market for manga after Japan. It's also the second market for American comics after USA. And it's the first market for French comics book, of course. And I don't think the readers who read manga, I don't know if what I do, if I lose readers, for instance. People who read my books, some would also read manga, or some would not read manga. I don't know if I'm losing readers because of the manga. I don't think that's probably not always the same population. But also about the influence, there is a lot of MAFA, like manga français, like new cartoonists, French cartoonists, taking influence from Japanese or Korean manga since ever the 80s, since Goldorak, and I think it's good. We are very lucky in a sense to have access to Japanese, Korean, American, French, and Belgian culture, and we can have everything, and it reflects on today's creation, I think.
Yeah, and I think we should be even more open to that. You were saying earlier that that Indians are very open to different
Different styles
graphic
and
style. They were very much appreciating the mixes, the reusing of other graphic features. I think we should go even more in that way. And I see that with my students, is that they are all heavily influenced by manga, much more than we were when we were students. And what I wanted to do is start with that interest in manga, and not try to teach them the canon, the standards, and where they should go, but try to actually make them look a little bit further in manga and try to diversify, but starting from there because it's the reality. And very recently there was this this cultural pass, so every young children, adolescent was given, I think, 300 euros.
Yes,
or
a
something.
cultural pass you can use to buy culture, to go to the opera or to buy books, and yeah, the young people will
And they
buy-
mostly bought manga, like heavily, and I think that just we have to.
But I
start
just
from
wish
there.
Japanese people would read more French comics sometimes.
yeah. One more question, I mean, and we can close. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I just saw her, so last question. Is there any? I cannot just. No, you. Yeah. So please be brief and yeah.
Good evening. I just wanted to ask you, as an illustrator, how much are you influenced by the cyberpunk aesthetics? Like, I personally know a French illustrator who is based in Tokyo, and they are heavily influenced by the cyberpunk aesthetics, and their illustrations reflect those colors, those color scheme, purple and blue. So, how much are you influenced by that?
Maybe
Have you seen Cheyenne's work?
Maybe
I mean,
not
you
that
should go
much.
and see. I mean, he's actually probably more influenced by a lot of Indian aesthetics.
Oh.
And
but-
I'm mostly influenced by the early modern aesthetic, constructivist, suprematist.
Okay. Thank you.
she's very interested in geometrical shapes and how those shapes. So please look at the cookbook, that she illustrated, Abhijit Binayak Bandyopadhyay's cookbook. And if you can look at that, you can see Cheyenne's illustration. You'll see more of her. So we'll be very proud to say that, we hosted her. When she will become big, I don't know.
But I would say it's always a patchwork of influence. So when you sometimes you look back at what you do and you try to. I know, for example, that I do the chins very much in a manga style. I do the eyes very much in an Egyptian style. I have a very Mickey way of doing the hands, and I use a lot the linear clear movements, lines. So when you start looking at your work, you can actually see the whole cultural feuilleté of influences, and the thing is always to be open to more influences. That's how you grow up. Otherwise, you just stay stuck in one style.
Yeah. For me, I used to do a lot of science fiction work when I was a teenager. When I start learning how to make 3D animation, I will draw like spaceships and stuff like that and animate them. So for a couple of years, I was doing a lot of things like that. But then now I'm doing like reportage into comics book. So I don't do steampunk anymore, unless I can do a reportage in a steampunk world, which maybe there is one somewhere. I need to find a vortex to enter this universe. But maybe one day I will go back to that kind of influence, but not at the moment.
Yeah, so we are really out of time, but we had a wonderful kind of conversation, frankly. I mean, you can just go on and on because, a lot of you may not actually be acquainted with French comic scene. So I would actually advise all of you to go beyond Tintin and Asterix because, that's the starting point and you will understand that's not even the beginning, It has got so many facets, so many stuff, so many things, the nuances, and it's so mature. It is really, really a different kind of, the comic scene out there. We just hope, from India, we are just like taking baby steps. We just hope maybe one day, we will sort of, at least carve our own identity. So,
but I still have to say that among all of that diversity, especially in children's picture book, my favorite ones are still Tara books from Chennai.
So Tara books.
They are absolutely wonderful, and I think I bought all of their books this trip.
And Cheyenne is also a great fan of Satyajit Ray as well. She was asking for her illustration. So, wonderful. Thank you so much. We are really, really out of time. Nicholas, thank you.
Thank you.
He's just arrived from Iran in the morning, and he is in the session today. So, please, a big round of applause. He barely slept, I mean, like, he just, coming out and doing the session. And also Cheyenne, wonderful. We actually were discussing, and with so much things, that she's interested in India as well. So, big round of applause for both of them. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
You.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Shukriya.
Good night.
I'd like to thank our speakers for a really engaging